The baby's cry tore through the ranch house like a knife, cutting through silence. James Thornton pressed his rough, work-worn hand against the wooden cradle, feeling it shake with each scream from his newborn daughter. 3 days had passed since Mary died, bringing her into this world. 3 days since he'd watched them lower his wife into the cold Wyoming ground while this tiny, red-faced stranger wailed in the midwife's arms. 3 days of watching his daughter's lips grow paler, her cries growing weaker with each passing hour. He tried everything a desperate man could think of. The sugar water the doctor recommended barely kept her quiet for an hour. He'd ridden through a thunderstorm to the Patterson Ranch 15 miles north, only to find their dairy cow had gone dry from some sickness spreading through the valley. The Hendersons to the east had nothing to offer. Old Widow Morrison tried to help with thin broth, but the baby just spit it up and screamed harder. Even the goat he'd bought from traveling farmer kicked him square in the ribs and produced nothing but a few useless drops. The town was 40 miles away over mountain roads that the autumn storm had turned into rivers of mud. The doctor had been clear during his last visit yesterday morning. She needs mother's milk, James. Nothing else will do for a newborn this young. Maybe in a few months she could handle cow's milk, but right now, he hadn't finished the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what happened to babies who couldn't feed. James had already buried his wife. He couldn't bear the thought of digging another grave. Now, as the fourth day's sun began to set, painting the ranch in shades of orange and red that reminded him too much of fire and endings, James sat at his kitchen table with his head in his hands. The baby's cries had weakened to soft whimpers. That scared him more than the screaming. At least when she screamed, she had fight left in her. These quiet little sounds meant she was giving up. Death had already taken his wife. Now it circled his daughter like a vulture waiting for the right moment to strike. The knock at the door was so soft he almost missed it. For a moment, James thought he'd imagined it. Who would be visiting at this hour? Most folks had paid their respects after the funeral and left him alone with his grief. The second knock came a little louder, more urgent. He dragged himself to his feet and opened the door. Rebecca Hayes stood on his porch, 22 years old and shaking like a leaf in the wind. She wore a simple gray dress with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and her dark hair was coming loose from its bun. Her eyes were red, whether from crying or from the cold wind. James couldn't tell. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward her father-in-law's property line, visible in the distance where the Hayes ranch bordered his own. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard about the baby, about what you've been trying to do." James felt something crack inside his chest. Of course she'd heard. Everyone in the valley knew by now that he was failing to keep his daughter alive. Everyone knew he was watching her die by inches. "Rebecca," he said, his voice rough from 3 days of not really talking to anyone, "I appreciate you coming by, but unless you know where I can find a wet nurse in the next few hours, I don't think there's anything anyone can do." She flinched at his harsh tone, but she didn't leave. Instead, she took a step closer and lowered her voice even more. "Mr. Thornton, James, I can help." He stared at her, not understanding. Rebecca Hayes had been married to Daniel, his childhood friend and Cyrus Hayes' only son. Daniel had died 8 months ago in a ranching accident that still made James's stomach turn when he thought about it. Rebecca had been Daniel's wife for 4 years, married at 18 to a man who'd been kind, but never quite knew how to make her smile. James remembered seeing her at Mary's funeral, standing apart from everyone else, her face pale and drawn. He remembered thinking she looked like a ghost herself. "Rebecca, I don't understand. How could you possibly?" "I had a baby," she said quickly, the words tumbling out like she had to say them fast or lose her courage entirely. 3 months ago. He didn't make it. He was born sleeping." Her voice broke on the last words, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "But the milk, it never stopped coming. The doctor said it would dry up on its own, but it hasn't. It hurts, Mr. Thornton. Every day it hurts, and it reminds me of what I lost, and I I heard your baby crying when I was out near the property line yesterday, and I thought, maybe, maybe I could help. James felt the world tilt sideways. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself. You're saying you could nurse her? Rebecca nodded, her whole body trembling now. If you'll let me. I know it's not proper. I know people would talk. But your baby is dying, and I have what she needs, and I can't just stand by and let another baby die when I could do something about it. She looked up at him with desperate eyes. Please, Mr. Thornton, let me do this one good thing. Let me save one baby since I couldn't save my own. From inside the house, his daughter's weak cry drifted through the open door. It sounded more like a kitten than a human baby, thin and fading. James looked at Rebecca, really looked at her. He saw the grief carved into her young face, the way she held herself like someone expecting to be hit, the desperate hope in her eyes that warred with shame and fear. He thought about Mary, about the kind of woman she'd been. He thought about what she would say if she were here. She would tell him to save their daughter, no matter what it cost. Your father-in-law, James said slowly. Cyrus, he can't know about this. He'd never allow it. He won't know, Rebecca said quickly. He thinks I'm doing evening chores. I can come early in the morning before he wakes and again at dusk. He'll never have to know. She paused, then added in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. He already blames me for Daniel's death. He says I distracted him that day. If he knew about the baby I lost, he'd say God was punishing me. Please don't tell him. James's daughter cried again, weaker this time. He was out of options. He was out of time. He was out of everything except this one impossible choice. Let his daughter die to protect everyone's reputation, or accept help from a young widow who'd already lost everything and was offering the only thing she had left to give. Come in, he said, stepping aside. Please, come in. Rebecca moved past him into the house, and James caught the scent of lavender and wood smoke. She walked straight to the bedroom where the baby lay in her cradle, not hesitating, not asking for directions. James followed her, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He watched as Rebecca looked down at his daughter, and something in her face softened and broke at the same time. She looks like Mary, Rebecca whispered. She has her chin. Yeah, James said, his throat tight. She does. Rebecca picked up the baby with practiced hands, cradling her against her chest. The baby's cries grew louder for a moment, frantic with hunger. Rebecca looked at James, and he saw her asking silent permission one more time. He nodded and turned away, giving her privacy. He walked to the doorway and stood with his back to the room, staring out at the darkening sky. Behind him, he heard the rustle of fabric. Then, after a moment that felt like an eternity, his daughter's crying stopped. Just stopped. In its place came soft sounds of feeding, the small noises a baby makes when she's finally getting what she needs. James closed his eyes and felt tears burn behind his eyelids. Relief hit him like a physical force, so strong his knees almost buckled. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 20. James lost track of time, standing there in the doorway, listening to his daughter live. Finally, he heard Rebecca's soft voice behind him. Mr. Thornton, you could turn around now. He turned. Rebecca stood there holding his daughter, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in 3 days. The baby's face had relaxed, her tiny fists unclenched. She looked content. She looked alive. She's strong, Rebecca said, and there were tear tracks on her face, but also something like joy. She's going to make it, Mr. Thornton, but she'll need to feed again in a few hours, and then every few hours after that. If I can come back tomorrow morning? Yes, James said, his voice hoarse. Please, yes. He paused, trying to find words big enough for what she'd just done. Rebecca, I can't even begin to thank you. Don't thank me, she said quickly, laying the baby gently back in her cradle. This isn't charity, Mr. Thornton. This is healing for me too. Helping her helps me. It makes the pain mean something. She pulled her shawl back around her shoulders. I should go before Cyrus notices I've been gone too long. I'll come back before dawn. Can you keep her comfortable until then?" "I'll manage," James said. "I'll keep her warm and hold her if she fusses." Rebecca nodded and moved toward the door. James followed her, and when they reached the porch, she turned back one more time. "Mr. Thornton." "James, this has to stay between us. If anyone finds out, especially Cyrus, I won't be able to come back. And your daughter needs me for at least a few more weeks until she's strong enough for other milk." "I understand," James said. "Your secret's safe with me." She gave him a small, sad smile and then disappeared into the gathering darkness. James watched her go, watched her small figure move quickly across the property line toward the Hayes Ranch. He was about to close the door when he saw it. A lantern flickering to life in a window of the Hayes house. Someone was awake. Someone might have been watching. He stood there for a long moment, staring at that distant light, fear curling in his gut. Then his daughter made a small sound from inside the house, a soft, comfortable noise of a fed baby settling into sleep. James looked back at her cradle, then back at the light in the Hayes window. Whatever happened next, whatever price they'd have to pay, at least tonight his daughter was alive. And tomorrow morning, Rebecca would come back. They'd face whatever came after that when it came. For now, this was enough. It had to be enough. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute when James heard the soft knock the next morning. He'd been awake for hours, watching his daughter sleep in the cradle beside his chair, afraid that if he closed his eyes, she might stop breathing. When Rebecca slipped through the door, she brought the smell of hay and cold morning air with her. "How is she?" Rebecca asked, already moving toward the cradle. "She slept," James said, and the relief in his voice surprised even him. Really slept. For almost 4 hours straight. Rebecca picked up the baby, who was just starting to fuss with early hunger. "That's good. That's really good." She glanced toward the window, where the sky was just beginning to lighten from black to deep blue. "I don't have much time. Cyrus wakes when the rooster crows." James nodded and turned away again, giving her privacy. He busied himself making coffee, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind spun with everything that had happened. This was his house, his kitchen, his dead wife's bedroom. And in that room, another woman was nursing his child. The wrongness of it mixed with the rightness of it until he couldn't tell which feeling was stronger. When Rebecca emerged 20 minutes later, his daughter was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "She's eating well," Rebecca said softly. "She's going to be fine, James. I promise you that." It was the first time she called him by his first name without the Mr. in front of it. Something about it made the situation feel more real and more complicated at the same time. "I'll come back tonight," she continued. "Around dusk, same as yesterday. Will that work?" "Yes," he said. "Thank you, Rebecca." Truly. She handed him the baby and slipped out the door as quietly as she'd come. James stood at the window and watched her hurry across the property line just as the sun broke over the horizon. He saw her slip into the Hayes barn, probably to make it look like she'd been doing morning chores all along. The baby stirred in his arms, and he looked down at her peaceful face. For the first time since Mary died, he felt something other than crushing grief. He felt hope. The routine established itself over the next week. Rebecca came before dawn and again at dusk, never staying longer than necessary, always glancing nervously toward her father-in-law's house. James kept watch, making sure no neighbors rode by during her visits. They barely spoke at first, just the necessary words about the baby's health and feeding schedule. But silence has a way of becoming uncomfortable, and gradually, brief conversations began to emerge. "You should name her," Rebecca said one evening as she rocked the baby after feeding. "She needs a name." James had been avoiding it, some superstitious part of him afraid that naming her would make losing her hurt more if something went wrong. But Rebecca was right. "Grace," he said finally. Mary's middle name was Grace. She always said it meant undeserved blessing. Rebecca smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Grace Thornton. It's perfect. What was your baby's name?" James asked before he could stop himself. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." Thomas, Rebecca said quietly. After Daniel's grandfather. I only got to hold him for a few minutes before they took him away. They said it was better not to dwell on it. Better to move on quickly. Her voice hardened, as if you can just forget you carried a life inside you for 9 months. Mary was pregnant before Grace. James found himself saying, lost at 3 months. She cried for weeks. Everyone told her the same thing. Move on, try again, don't dwell. Like grief has a schedule you're supposed to follow. Rebecca looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw understanding. Not pity, not sympathy, but real understanding from someone who knew what it meant to lose everything. Nobody talks about the lost babies, she said. Nobody talks about dying in childbirth or husbands who die in accidents or any of it. We're all just supposed to smile and be strong and pretend we're not bleeding inside. Yeah, James said. That's exactly it. It was the most honest conversation he'd had since Mary died. Maybe the most honest conversation he'd had in years. There was something about shared loss that cut through all the polite, pretending people usually did. Rebecca understood his grief because she was drowning in her own. And for the first time since he'd lowered Mary into the ground, James didn't feel completely alone. Small kindnesses began appearing. James started leaving hot coffee on the stove for Rebecca's early morning visits. She started arriving a few minutes early, and he'd find her sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunrise and drinking the coffee like it was the most precious thing she'd ever tasted. Rebecca noticed that some of Grace's baby clothes were coming apart at the seams, and one evening she brought her sewing basket. While Grace slept after feeding, Rebecca mended every tiny dress and blanket without being asked. James rode the property line one afternoon and noticed the fence between his land and the Hayes Ranch was falling apart in several places. He spent a day fixing it, working on the Hayes side of the line, never mentioning it to Rebecca. But the next morning, she whispered, "Thank you for the fence," as she handed Grace back to him. And he knew she understood it was payment of a debt he could never really repay. On Sunday, James rode into town for supplies and stopped by the cemetery. He stood at Mary's grave for a long time, talking to her the way he had when she was alive. "There's a woman helping with Grace," he said to the headstone. "Rebecca Hayes. You remember her, Daniel's wife. She lost her own baby, and she's been nursing Grace. I know it's strange, Mary. I know people would say it's wrong. But our daughter is alive because of her. I think you'd understand. I think you'd be grateful too." The wind rustled through the grass, and James chose to believe it was Mary's way of agreeing. On his way out of the cemetery, he picked wildflowers from the field and tied them with a piece of twine. That evening, when Rebecca arrived, he handed them to her without explanation. She looked at them, then at him, and understanding passed between them. The next morning, he saw fresh flowers on Mary's grave. Rebecca must have placed them there in the pre-dawn darkness, honoring the woman whose child she was saving. But small towns have eyes everywhere, and secrets have a way of coming to light. By the end of the second week, James started noticing things. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd refused him milk, watched him extra carefully at church. The blacksmith asked too many questions about how little Grace was managing. The general store owner's wife made a pointed comment about how healthy the baby looked for an infant without a mother. "How is that baby of yours doing, James?" Mrs. Patterson asked him one Sunday after service. "Last I heard, you couldn't find milk anywhere in the valley." "She's managing," James said carefully, "getting stronger every day." "Is that so?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "And how exactly is she managing? You find a wet nurse somewhere." "I'm making do," James said, and excused himself before she could ask more questions. But he could feel eyes on his back as he walked his wagon. People were talking. People were wondering. It was only a matter of time before someone figured it out. That evening, when Rebecca arrived, James told her about the questions. "People are getting suspicious," he said. "They know Grace couldn't survive this long on sugar water." Rebecca's face went pale. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing specific, But Rebecca, if they start watching the house, if they see you coming and going, I'll be more careful, she said quickly. I'll come earlier, leave later when it's darker. We just need a few more weeks. Grace is getting stronger, but she's not ready for cow's milk yet. Please, James, we can't stop now. He wanted to argue, wanted to say it was too dangerous, but one look at Grace's healthy pink face told him the truth. His daughter needed Rebecca. So did he, though he was only beginning to understand in what ways. The problem was Cyrus Hayes. Rebecca's father-in-law had always been a hard man, made harder by losing his only son. He blamed Rebecca from the start, saying she distracted Daniel that day, made him careless around the machinery that killed him. After Daniel's funeral, Cyrus had kept Rebecca on at the ranch because it was proper, because she was his son's widow, but he treated her like a servant. She told James bits and pieces during their brief conversations, how Cyrus barely spoke to her, how he blamed her for not giving Daniel children while he was alive, how he'd forbidden her from mentioning the stillborn baby because it shamed the family. He doesn't know about Thomas. Rebecca had confessed one night. I was only 6 months along when Daniel died. I hid it for as long as I could because I knew Cyrus would make it worse somehow. When the baby came early and didn't survive, the midwife helped me keep it quiet. Cyrus thinks I was just sick for a few days. He has no idea I was ever pregnant. The secrecy of it all was suffocating. Rebecca was hiding her dead baby from her father-in-law while secretly nursing someone else's child. James was hiding Rebecca's visits from the whole town. They were both balancing on a knife's edge, and the slightest misstep would send them both tumbling into scandal. On a Wednesday morning at the start of the 3rd week, Rebecca arrived late. The sun was already fully up, and James had been pacing the floor with a fussy grace for an hour. When Rebecca finally slipped through the door, his relief turned to alarm. She had a bruise on her left cheek, dark purple and swelling. "What happened?" he demanded. "Nothing," she said quickly, reaching for Grace. "I'm fine, Rebecca." He stepped in front of her, forcing her to meet his eyes. "What happened?" Her shoulders sagged. "Cyrus. He was up early, saw me coming back from the barn. Asked why I was out there so long. I said I was checking on a sick calf, but he didn't believe me. He grabbed my face and said if he finds out I'm lying to him, if he finds out I've been anywhere improper." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. James felt rage burn through him like wildfire. "He can't treat you like that. You're his daughter-in-law, not his property." In his mind, "I'm both," Rebecca said bitterly. "Daniel left me to him when he died, and I have nowhere else to go, no family to run to. My parents died of fever when I was 16. Daniel was all I had, and now." She stopped, swallowed hard. "I need to feed Grace. We don't have much time." She took the baby and disappeared into the bedroom, and James stood in his kitchen with his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to ride over to the Hayes ranch and put his fist through Cyrus's face. He wanted to tell Rebecca she could stay here, that she didn't have to go back to a man who hurt her. But he couldn't do either of those things without making everything worse. When Rebecca emerged, she moved toward the door quickly. "I'll try to come tonight, but if I can't make it, don't worry. Grace should be okay for a few hours longer now that she's stronger." "Rebecca, wait." James caught her hand before she could leave. "If he hurts you again." "He won't," she said, but they both knew it was a lie. "I'll be more careful. I'll be better at hiding it." She pulled her hand free and slipped out the door. James watched her cross the property line in broad daylight, taking risks she shouldn't have to take, and he felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't just about Grace anymore. This wasn't just about a widow helping a widower out of charity. Something more was growing between them, something built on shared grief and midnight conversations and the intimacy of depending on each other for survival. That night, Rebecca didn't come. Grace fussed and cried, refusing the sugar water James tried to give her. He walked the floor with her for hours, watching the sun set and darkness fall, watching for Rebecca's figure crossing the property line. She never came. He tried again the next morning, But Rebecca didn't appear. Grace was getting weaker again, her cries more desperate. James stood at his window, staring toward the Hayes ranch, fear and anger warring in his gut. What was Cyrus doing to her? Had he locked her in? Hurt her worse than a bruised cheek? Or had Rebecca simply decided the risk was too great and abandoned them? No, he refused to believe that. Rebecca wouldn't abandon Grace, not after everything, which meant something was preventing her from coming. Something bad. On the third night, just as James was considering riding over to the Hayes ranch and demanding to see Rebecca regardless of the consequences, he saw it. Thick, dark smoke rising against the twilight sky. Not the thin white smoke of a chimney fire, but heavy black smoke that meant something was burning. Something big. James grabbed his coat and ran for his horse, his heart hammering. The Hayes ranch was on fire, and Rebecca was somewhere in the middle of it. He dug his heels into his horse's sides and rode hard through the darkness. Grace's desperate cries fading behind him, replaced by the roar of flames ahead. The flames painted the night sky orange and red, and James could feel the heat from 50 yards away. The Hayes barn was fully engulfed, fire climbing the wooden walls like living creatures racing toward the roof. Cyrus Hayes stood in the yard with two field hands, all of them throwing buckets of water that did nothing against the inferno. The horses were screaming inside, trapped and terrified. James jumped off his horse and ran toward Cyrus. "Where's Rebecca?" he shouted over the roar of the flames. Cyrus turned, his face black with soot, eyes wild. "In the house. Locked in her room. I can't get to her. Too much smoke." James didn't wait to hear more. He sprinted toward the main house where smoke was pouring from the windows. The fire had spread from the barn, and flames were already licking up the side of the house toward the second floor. He could hear Rebecca screaming from a window above, pounding on the glass. The front door was hot to the touch. James kicked it open and was immediately hit by a wall of smoke so thick he couldn't see 2 feet in front of him. He dropped low where the air was clearer and crawled toward the stairs. His eyes burned and his lungs felt like they were filling with ash. But he kept moving. Rebecca's screams grew louder as he climbed the stairs, following the sound through the darkness. He found her door locked from the outside. "Rebecca, get back from the door." He threw his shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times before the wood splintered and gave way. Rebecca was crouched by the window, coughing so hard she couldn't stand. James grabbed her and pulled her toward the hallway, but the stairs were now completely engulfed in flames. The fire had spread faster than he'd thought possible. "The window," Rebecca gasped, pointing back to her room. "Only way out." They stumbled back into her room. James grabbed a chair and smashed it through the window, clearing away the jagged glass. It was a 15-foot drop to the ground, high enough to break bones but better than burning alive. "I'll lower you as far as I can," he said. "Then you have to drop." He gripped her wrists and leaned out the window, lowering her down the side of the house. Rebecca's fingers dug into his arms as she dangled in the air. "Let go," he shouted. "I've got you as far as I can." She dropped, hitting the ground hard and rolling. James didn't hesitate. He climbed out the window and hung from the sill for a moment before letting himself fall. He landed badly, his ankles screaming in pain, but he forced himself up and grabbed Rebecca. They stumbled away from the house, just as part of the roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks and burning timber. Cyrus reached them, pulling Rebecca into his arms. She was coughing violently, her face covered in soot, but she was alive. James bent over with his hands on his knees, trying to breathe through lungs that felt scorched. When he looked up, he saw neighbors arriving, drawn by the flames. Mrs. Patterson and her husband, the blacksmith, the general store owner, at least a dozen people who'd come to help fight the fire, but had arrived just in time to see James Thornton carrying Rebecca Hayes out of her bedroom window. The whispers started immediately. James could see it in their faces, the way they looked between him and Rebecca, the the calculations happening behind their eyes. A widowed man and a young widow, alone together in a bedroom. Never mind that the house was on fire. Never mind that he'd just saved her life. All they saw was scandal. Cyrus seemed to realize it at the same moment. He looked at James holding his daughter-in-law, looked at the gathered crowd, and something shifted in his face. "You came for her," he said quietly. "You could have left her locked in there. Could have said you didn't know." "She's been saving my daughter's life," James said, too tired to lie anymore. "Every morning and every evening for 3 weeks. She's been nursing Grace. I owe her everything." The crowd went silent. Rebecca looked up at James with terror in her eyes, but it was too late to take the words back. The truth was out, exposed by necessity and exhaustion in the aftermath of near death. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth. The blacksmith shook his head slowly. The general store owner's wife made a disgusted sound and turned away. But Cyrus surprised them all. He looked at Rebecca with something that might have been shame or might have been gratitude. "My son's widow saved your daughter?" he asked James. "Yes," James said, "and I just saved her. That makes us even, as far as I'm concerned." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Daniel would have wanted that. He loved James like a brother. He would have wanted his wife to help his friend's child." He paused, looking around at the watching crowd. There's no shame in Christian charity. There's no shame in saving a baby's life. It wasn't enough to stop the whispers. James could hear them starting already, spreading through the crowd like the fire had spread through the barn. By morning, everyone in town would know. By Sunday, it would be the only thing anyone talked about. The secret was over, and James had no idea what came next. Rebecca was still coughing, clinging to her father-in-law's arm. She looked at James through the smoke and flames and said in a voice raw from screaming, "They all know now. What happens to Grace? What happens to us?" Before James could answer, the sheriff rode up on his horse, drawn by the fire like everyone else. He took in the scene. The burning buildings, the crowd, James and Rebecca covered in soot and standing too close together. His face hardened. "James Thornton," he said, "Town council's calling an emergency meeting. Tomorrow night. They want to talk about this situation." He gestured between James and Rebecca. All of it. The town council meeting was held in the church because it was the only building large enough to hold everyone who wanted to attend. James walked in with his head high, but his stomach was churning. The entire town had showed up, packing the pews like it was Christmas service. Rebecca sat in the front row with Cyrus beside her, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. James took his seat across the aisle and didn't look at her. He couldn't. If he looked at her, he'd lose whatever courage he'd managed to scrape together. Mayor Hutchins stood at the front, flanked by the other council members. 3 older men who'd run this town for as long as James could remember. "We're here to address a situation that's come to light," the mayor began. "A situation involving James Thornton and Rebecca Hayes that concerns the moral standards of our community." Mrs. Patterson stood up without being called on. "That girl has been alone with him for weeks. An unmarried woman and a widowed man, spending time together in private. It's improper. It's sinful. And now the whole territory will be talking about our town like we have no standards at all. She was saving my daughter's life," James said, standing. "Grace would have died without her. Every single person in this room turned me away when I needed help. Rebecca was the only one who stepped forward." "There are proper ways to handle these things," Mayor Hutchins said. "You could have sent the baby to an orphanage temporarily. You could have advertised for a wet nurse from another town. You didn't have to engage in this arrangement with a young woman barely out of mourning herself." "My daughter was dying," James said, his voice rising. "She had maybe 2 days left. There was no time for proper ways. Rebecca offered help, and I took it because I'm a father and my child needed to live." The room erupted in arguing voices. Some people nodded in agreement. Others shook their heads in disgust. Mayor Hutchins banged his gavel until the noise died down. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, looking at Rebecca, "you want to speak on this matter?" Rebecca stood slowly. James could see her hands shaking, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I lost my baby 3 months ago," she said, and the room went silent. "My son was stillborn. I held him for a few minutes, and then they took him away and told me to forget about him. But I couldn't forget, and the milk kept coming, reminding me every day of what I'd lost. When I heard James's baby crying and knew she was dying from hunger, I thought maybe I could do one good thing. Maybe I could give my pain a purpose." Her voice broke, but she kept going. "If helping a motherless baby survive is sinful, then I'll answer to God for it. But I won't apologize to you people. Not when you all stood by and did nothing while an infant starved." Several women in the crowd looked away, shame coloring their faces. Mrs. Patterson's husband shifted uncomfortably, but the mayor wasn't moved. "The issue isn't charity, Mrs. Hayes. The issue is propriety. A young widow spending time alone with a widowed man creates talk. It creates scandal, and scandal affects this entire community." Then Cyrus Hayes stood up, and the room went quiet again. Everyone knew Cyrus, knew his temper, knew his hardness, knew he'd barely spoken to his daughter-in-law since his son died. "James Thornton saved my daughter-in-law's life last night," Cyrus said, his voice rough. "Ran into a burning building when he could have stayed safe. Rebecca saved his daughter's life when everyone else turned their backs. That's all that matters to me. My son would have done the same thing if he were alive. He would have wanted his wife to help his childhood friend." The council members exchanged glances. Finally, Mayor Hutchins spoke. "Here's what we've decided. James, you have 2 weeks to make a choice. Either send the baby to an orphanage in Denver until you can find a proper situation, or marry a suitable woman who can take care of her, or leave this town entirely and take your scandal somewhere else. Those are your options." James felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Grace is 6 weeks old. She still needs mother's milk for at least another month, maybe 2. "You're asking me to choose between my daughter's health and staying in my home. We're asking you to think about what's best for everyone involved," the mayor said, "including that child's future. You think she wants to grow up with everyone knowing her father was involved in a scandal? You think any of this is good for her?" The meeting ended with no real resolution, just ultimatums and judgment. James walked out into the cool night air and stood on the church steps, tried to breathe. Rebecca emerged a moment later with Cyrus, and their eyes met across the churchyard. James saw devastation in her face, saw her blaming herself for all of it. That night, James lay awake in his bed, listening to Grace sleep peacefully in her cradle. He'd saved her life only to lose everything else: his reputation, his place in this community, maybe even his home. And Rebecca had sacrificed even more. She'd exposed her deepest pain to a room full of strangers, admitted to losing a baby she'd kept secret, all to defend him, to defend their arrangement, to defend what they'd built together over these past 3 weeks. When morning came, he found a note slipped under his door. His hands shook as he unfolded it and read Rebecca's handwriting. "I'm leaving town. It's the only way to end this. Take care of Grace. She'll always be in my heart. Tell Cyrus I'm sorry I couldn't be the daughter-in-law Daniel deserved." Or, James crumpled the note in his fist and ran outside. The sun was just rising, painting the sky pink and gold. Across the property line, he could see Cyrus standing in his yard, staring at the barn ruins. James ran over, his heart pounding. Where is she? Where's Rebecca? Cyrus turned, and his face was stricken. Gone. Took her horse before dawn. She left me a note, too. Said she was heading to Denver, to an aunt who lives there. He paused. She took nothing but her mother's Bible and the clothes on her back. James! She's not coming back. James looked toward the mountains, toward the pass that led to Denver. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, the kind of clouds that meant an early autumn storm, the kind that could turn deadly in the high country. James didn't think. He just moved. He ran back to his house, grabbed his heavy coat and supplies, and headed for the stable. Grace was crying inside, but Cyrus appeared at his elbow. "Go," the old man said. "I'll watch the baby. Just bring my daughter-in-law back alive." The irony wasn't lost on James, leaving his daughter with the man who had locked Rebecca in a room and caused all this mess. But there was no time to find anyone else, and something in Cyrus's face told him the old man had finally realized what he'd done. James mounted his horse and rode hard toward the mountain pass, racing against the storm clouds gathering overhead. The wind picked up as he climbed higher into the mountains. Within an hour, the first snowflakes began falling, big, wet flakes that stuck to everything they touched. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. It was only early October. But Montana weather didn't care about calendars, and James had seen storms like this turn deadly before. He found Rebecca's horse first, standing on 3 legs in a shallow ravine, its right front leg clearly broken. The animal whinnied when it saw him, and James's heart sank. If Rebecca's horse was here, injured, then she was on foot in an approaching blizzard. He followed her footprints in the fresh snow, watching them grow fainter as the snowfall intensified. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was picking up. She wouldn't survive the night out here alone. He found her huddled in a shallow cave, barely more than an overhang of rock. She was shaking violently, her lips blue, her dress soaked through from snow. Her eyes were barely open, and when she saw him, she tried to speak, but couldn't form words through her chattering teeth. "Don't talk," James said, pulling off his heavy coat and wrapping it around her. "Save your strength." He gathered what dry wood he could find and built a small fire at the cave entrance, blocking the wind. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The storm was intensifying outside, snow falling so thick he could barely see 10 feet beyond the cave mouth. They were trapped here until it passed. Rebecca huddled close to the fire, and slowly, painfully, the color started returning to her face. "You shouldn't have come," she finally whispered. "You should have let me go and let you freeze to death in the mountains." That wasn't happening. James sat beside her, close enough to share warmth but not touching. "Grace needs you. I need you." "The town," Rebecca started, but James cut her off. "The town doesn't live in my house. They don't know what these past weeks have been like. They don't know what you mean to us." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You came to my door when I was watching my daughter die. You saved her life. But somewhere along the way, you saved mine too. I was dead inside, Rebecca, just going through motions, haunting my own life. And then you showed up every morning and every evening, and suddenly I had a reason to wake up, not just for Grace, for you." Rebecca looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "I can't keep doing this, James. I can't keep watching Grace grow and knowing I have to leave eventually. It hurts too much, and the scandal is killing both of you. Everyone will always whisper about you, about her, because of me." "Then don't leave," James said. "Stay. Not just for Grace. Stay for me. For us. Whatever that means, however it looks, stay." "I'm 22 years old," Rebecca said. "You're a grown man with a life and a ranch and a daughter. I'm just the widow who helped you for a few weeks." "You're not just anything," James said fiercely. "You're the woman who walked into death's path and pulled my daughter back. You're the person who made my house feel like a home again. You're someone who understands loss and grief and what it means to keep living anyway." He paused. "Mary will always be Grace's mother. Daniel will always be your first husband. But that doesn't mean we can't choose to live again. Together." The storm raged outside their small cave, and the temperature continued to drop. James added more wood to the fire, but they both knew it wouldn't be enough to keep them warm through the night. "We need to share body heat," he said. "It's the only way we'll make it until morning." Rebecca nodded and moved closer. James wrapped his arms around her, and she leaned into his chest. They sat like that for hours as the storm howled outside, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Rebecca told him about her marriage to Daniel, how they'd been too young and never quite figured out how to love each other properly. James told her about Mary, how he'd loved her, but also how he'd been sleepwalking through life even before she died. I don't want to replace what you had, Rebecca whispered as the fire burned low. I don't want to be a substitute for Mary. You're not, James said. You're something completely different. Something I didn't know I needed until you knocked on my door. He paused. When this storm breaks, when we go back down that mountain, I want you to come home with me. Not to hide anymore. Not to sneak around. I want everyone to know you're part of my family now. Part of Grace's life. Part of my life. The town council said. I don't care what they said. They gave me choices, and I'm making one. I'm choosing you and Grace. If that means leaving town, we'll leave. If it means facing down every judgmental person in that church, we'll face them. Together. Rebecca was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "What are you really saying, James?" "I'm saying I was dead until you knocked on my door. Both of us were. And I'm not going back to that darkness. I'm choosing life. I'm choosing hope. I'm choosing you." The fire burned down to embers as they held each other through the long, cold night. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving everything covered in a blanket of white. They were both stiff and cold, but alive. James helped Rebecca onto his horse, and they rode down the mountain together as the sun turned the snow-covered landscape into something beautiful and new. When they reached town, it was mid-morning. People stopped and stared as they rode down Main Street together, James's arm around Rebecca to keep her steady on the horse. He didn't look away. He didn't make excuses. He rode straight through town to his ranch, helped Rebecca down, and walked with her into his house where Cyrus was rocking a sleeping Grace. The old man looked up, relief flooding his face. "Thank God," he whispered. Then, looking at Rebecca, "I'm sorry. For everything. For locking you in that room. For blaming you. For all of it." Rebecca nodded, accepting the apology without words. James took Grace from Cyrus, and the baby stirred and reached for Rebecca immediately. Rebecca took her, and Grace settled against her chest like she belonged there. Like she'd always belonged there. "So what happens now?" Cyrus asked. James looked at Rebecca, holding his daughter, looked at the woman who'd saved them both in more ways than one. "Now we face whatever comes next," he said. Together, within days, the whole town knew James had ridden into a deadly storm to bring Rebecca back. Some people said it proved there was something improper between them. Others said it proved he was a man of honor who wouldn't let someone die in the mountains. Either way, the talk intensified. Mrs. Patterson made it her personal mission to remind everyone at church that two unmarried people living under the same roof was scandalous. Never mind that Rebecca was staying in the guest room with Cyrus visiting daily to maintain propriety. But something had shifted in James. He'd spent 3 days thinking Rebecca was gone forever, and those 3 days had shown him what his life would be like without her. Empty, cold, just going through motions again. He wasn't willing to go back to that darkness, no matter what the town thought. 6 months passed like water flowing downstream, sometimes rushing, sometimes slow, but always moving forward. Grace grew stronger every day, thriving under Rebecca's care. By spring, she was 7 months old, sitting up on her own, reaching for both James and Rebecca with equal enthusiasm. She'd started making sounds that almost resembled words, and when she said something that sounded like "Mama," while looking at Rebecca, neither of them corrected her. The town had split into 2 camps. Some families still avoided James and Rebecca, crossing the street when they saw them coming, whispering behind hands at church. But others, particularly the women who'd lost babies themselves or knew the pain of childbirth, quietly offered support. Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone by showing up one day with a basket of food and an apology. "My sister lost her baby to milk fever," she said to Rebecca. "Nearly died herself from the pain of it. If someone had offered what you did for Grace, that would have been mercy, not sin. I was wrong to judge you. It wasn't a complete reversal, but it was enough. Enough to make the ranch feel less isolated. Enough to make Rebecca smile more often. Enough to make James believe they might actually have a future here." Cyrus had changed too. The hard, angry man who'd locked his daughter-in-law in a room had softened into something resembling a grandfather. He visited almost daily, playing with Grace, helping with ranch work, slowly rebuilding his relationship with Rebecca. One evening, he pulled James aside and said, "My son would be glad she has you. He'd be glad Grace has both of you. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I'm trying to do better." On a warm May evening, James stood on his porch watching Rebecca push Grace in a swing he'd built from rope and an old plank. Grace was squealing with delight, and Rebecca was laughing, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face bright with genuine happiness. This was what healing looked like, James thought. Not forgetting the pain, but learning to live alongside it. Learning to choose joy even when grief still lingered in the corners. That night, after Grace was asleep, James sat with Rebecca on the porch steps. He'd been carrying a small velvet box in his pocket for 2 months, waiting for the right moment. But watching her tonight, he realized there would never be a perfect moment. Life didn't work that way. "Rebecca," he said, pulling out the box, "I've been carrying this around for a while now, waiting for the right time. But maybe there's no such thing as the right time. Maybe there's just now." He opened the box to show a simple gold band with a small stone. It wasn't fancy. He wasn't a rich man, but it was real and solid and meant something. "It's not about the scandal anymore," he continued. "It's not about convenience or propriety or what anyone else thinks. It's about loving you, choosing this family we've built together. Will you marry me?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "I was 17 when I married Daniel because it's what our families wanted. I'm 22 now, and everything is different. You gave me purpose when I thought I had none. Grace gave me healing. You gave me a home." She paused, wiping at her tears. "Yes, yes, I'll marry me." They married quietly a month later in the same church where the town council had judged them. Not everyone came, but enough did to fill the pews halfway. Cyrus walked Rebecca down the aisle, giving her away to the man his son had called brother. Grace sat in the front row in Mrs. Patterson's arms, babbling happily through the ceremony. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the baby clapped her hands like she understood what it meant. Family. Finally and completely. 5 years passed like seasons changing, spring to summer to fall to winter and back again. The ranch prospered. James and Rebecca had 2 more children, a boy and a girl, and Rebecca was pregnant again. Grace was 5 years old now, smart and curious, and filled with her mother Mary's kindness and Rebecca's quiet strength. She didn't remember the desperate early days when she nearly died, but James and Rebecca had told her the story many times. How Mama Rebecca had saved her life. How love had shown up exactly when they needed it most. Cyrus had aged but softened further, spending his days reading to his grandchildren on the porch, teaching them about horses and ranching and being kind to people even when it was hard. He'd sold his ranch and moved into a small house in town, but he visited almost daily. The relationship he'd destroyed with Rebecca had been rebuilt slowly, carefully, into something that resembled forgiveness and family. On a warm summer afternoon, a young woman appeared at their door. She was maybe 20 years old, thin and frightened, with a baby in her arms and desperation in her eyes. "Mrs. Thornton," she said when Rebecca answered. "I heard. Someone in town said you help people like me. My baby, I can't. I lost so much blood during the birth, and I don't have milk, and everyone says she'll die without it, and I don't know what to do." Rebecca looked at the woman and saw herself 6 years ago, drowning in grief and fear and desperate to save something, anything from the wreckage. She looked back at James, who'd come up behind her. He smiled and nodded. Rebecca turned back to the young woman and opened the door wider. "Come inside. You're safe here. Let me see if I can find someone to help you." Within an hour, Rebecca had connected the young mother with another woman in town who just weaned her own baby and still had milk. She gave the desperate mother food and a safe place to rest, reassured her that her baby would survive, and sent her away with hope instead of fear. The mercy that had saved Grace 6 years ago was now being passed forward, multiplied, shared with others who needed it. That evening, the whole family gathered for dinner. James and Rebecca, their 4 children with another on the way, and Cyrus reading stories at the head of the table. The house was loud with laughter and chaos and the beautiful noise of life being fully lived. Grace climbed into James's lap after dinner and said, "Papa, tell the story again. About the day Mama Rebecca saved me." James smiled and pulled his daughter close. "It's your favorite story, isn't it? Tell it," Grace insisted. So James told the story once more, about the darkest days after Mary died, about the baby who was dying from hunger, about the knock on the door that changed everything. Rebecca added details he forgot, and Cyrus chimed in with his own perspective, and together they wove the tale of how tragedy had somehow led to healing, how loss had opened the door to love. When the story ended, Grace looked up at her father with serious eyes. "So Mama Rebecca saved me, and then you saved her, and then you both save each other?" "That's exactly right," James said. "I want to help people like that when I grow up." Grace said, "I want to save people." Rebecca reached over and touched her daughter's cheek. "Then that's what you'll do. That's how mercy works, sweetheart. Someone shows it to you, and then you pass it forward. It doesn't end. It just keeps multiplying." Later that night, after the children were asleep and Cyrus had gone home, James and Rebecca stood on their porch looking out at the ranch they'd built together. The mountains were dark shapes against a star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, another person was probably struggling, probably desperate, probably wondering if they'd survive their own tragedy. "Do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked quietly. "The scandal, the judgment, how hard it all was?" James pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Not for a second. You gave me Grace's life. You gave me my life back. You gave me a future I didn't think I'd have. The scandal was worth it. Every single hard moment was worth it." Rebecca leaned into him, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. "Mary brought Grace into this world," she said softly. "But we brought each other back to life. And now we get to pass that gift forward." Inside the house, one of the children stirred and called out. Rebecca moved to go inside, but James caught her hand. "I love you," he said. "I love Mary, and I'll always carry her with me. But I love you too. Both things can be true." "Both things are true," Rebecca agreed. She squeezed his hand and went inside to comfort their child. James stood on the porch a moment longer, looking at Mary's picture through the window, positioned on the mantel next to Daniel's pocket watch. The past honored, but not worshipped. The present embraced. The future full of possibility. This was what mercy looked like, James thought. This was what happened when people chose love over fear, when they chose to keep living even after loss tried to bury them. This was the legacy they'd leave their children. Not the scandal or the judgment or the hard early days, but this, the choice to help, the choice to heal, the choice to pass forward the grace they'd received. And somewhere in town, a young mother was feeding her baby, hope replacing despair, because someone had shown her mercy. The cycle continued. The story went on. Love multiplied in the darkness, one act of courage at a time.